The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, a single strike that divided South Africa. For some, it was the sound of justice finally being served. For others, it was the death knell of political freedom. On that day, Julius Malema, the firebrand leader of the economic freedom fighters, was officially declared a convicted criminal. His crime: firing what he insists was a toy gun in the air during a rally 7 years ago, but experts, prosecutors, and even rival politicians say otherwise. They say it was an assault rifle, a real one, a Saiga 308, a cousin of the AK-47. For 3 long days, the magistrate read her verdict page by page while the country held its breath. And when the word guilty finally echoed, the reaction split the nation clean in half. One side cried justice, the other screamed racism. The courtroom became a mirror, reflecting the deep divisions that have haunted South Africa since the end of apartheid. What followed was not silence but chaos. Accusations against the judge, claims of political conspiracy, and a fiery defense by Malema himself. They were never looking for justice, they were looking for me. To his followers, he is a revolutionary persecuted for truth. To his enemies, he is proof that arrogance and power can corrupt even the loudest voices for freedom. And now the question that no one dares to ask out loud: can a man who calls himself a liberator truly stand above the law? Or is South Africa witnessing the slow collapse of trust in its courts, its leaders, and its democracy itself? Stay with us, because in the next few minutes we'll uncover not just the verdict, but what it reveals about a nation still at war with its own reflection. Press subscribe if you believe justice must be seen, not shouted. It began, as many controversies do, with a single clip. A grainy video from years ago showing Julius Malema, red beret on his head, microphone in one hand, rifle in the other, firing several shots into the air during an economic freedom fighters rally. The crowd cheered, flags waved. And in that instant, South Africa's most polarizing political figure crossed a line that would follow him for 7 long years. Malema claimed it was a toy gun, part of a symbolic performance. But when the footage resurfaced, firearm experts disagreed. One of South Africa's foremost ballistic analysts studied the frames, slowed them down, and pointed to 2 details that would change everything: the recoil and the muzzle flash. "That's not a toy," he said. "That's a Saiga .308, a semi-automatic rifle modeled after the AK-47, a weapon powerful enough to pierce concrete and deadly if fired into the air above a crowd." According to South African law, even a single unauthorized discharge of such a weapon in a public place is a serious crime. It was no longer about political theater. It was about recklessness, endangerment, and the rule of law. Prosecutors charged Malema with 4 counts: unlawful possession of a firearm, unlawful possession of ammunition, discharging a firearm in a public place, recklessly endangering lives. The trial itself became a national spectacle. Cameras crowded the courthouse steps. Outside, EFF supporters sang liberation songs and shouted "Viva," while opponents demanded accountability. Inside, Malema faced the magistrate with the same defiant composure that made him famous. "I don't understand why the court wants me to help the state make its own case," he said during cross-examination. "No witness has shown I carried that weapon. My DNA was never found on it. My home was never searched. My workplace was never searched. You have nothing linking me to that gun." He argued that the prosecution's evidence was circumstantial, that no one had proven the rifle was real or that any bullet had harmed anyone. He reminded the court that no victim had ever come forward. Not one person said they feared for their lives, he insisted. But the state was unmoved. Their expert testimony and frame-by-frame analysis of the video convinced the magistrate that Malema had in fact fired a live weapon. What made the case even more serious was the type of firearm. A pistol would have meant a lighter sentence, but a rifle, particularly one resembling an AK-47, transformed the charge into something symbolically heavier. It evoked the country's violent past, its fragile peace, and the fear of chaos that still lingers beneath the surface. When the verdict was read after 3 days of deliberation, the courtroom fell silent. The magistrate declared him guilty on all counts. His co-accused, Adrian Sneeman, whom the state claimed supplied the weapon, was acquitted. That single contrast ignited a new firestorm. Malema rose from his seat, surrounded by his supporters, and declared that the judgment was not about justice, but about politics. He accused the court of racial bias and claimed that the system had been looking for a black revolutionary to punish. He vowed to appeal all the way to the Constitutional Court, proclaiming, "We are not scared of prison." Revolutionaries do not fear death. Outside, hundreds chanted his name while others called for his removal from parliament. Under Section 47 of South Africa's constitution, any member sentenced to more than 12 months in prison without the option of a fine loses eligibility to serve. For now, his seat remains safe until sentencing in January 2026, but the implications are grave. For the first time in years, South Africa's political theater moved from rallies to the rule of law. The question was no longer whether Julius Malema could inspire millions. It was whether he could still lead them from inside a courtroom. The moment the word guilty left the magistrate's lips, a storm erupted far beyond the courtroom walls. For 3 days, South Africans had waited for this, a decision that many feared would reopen the wounds of race politics and power. When it came, it didn't bring closure. It brought chaos. Inside the courtroom, Julius Malema lifted his fist in the air and shouted, "Viva EFF, viva!" The revolution supporters in red berets echoed his cry, while security guards struggled to contain the noise. To Malema's followers, this was not the fall of a leader, it was the rise of a martyr. To his opponents, it was proof that arrogance and rebellion could finally face justice. Outside, microphones waited for a statement. When Malema finally stepped before them, his voice was steady, but burning with defiance. "They have been looking for me, not for justice. They wanted to find a judge who would satisfy the white supremacists, the AfriForum, and even the Oval Office of Donald Trump." The crowd roared, fists in the air. His words struck deep, reviving an old narrative of struggle, black versus white, freedom versus control, the revolutionary versus the establishment. Within hours, social media exploded. The hashtag #HandsOffMalema trended alongside Wrench rule of law. The country had split into two echo chambers, each convinced the other was blind. From the legal side, the National Prosecuting Authority (NPA) spoke firmly. Their spokesperson Luvuyo Mfaku told reporters, "This judgment is not about politics, it is about evidence. The case was proven beyond reasonable doubt. The law applies to everyone, no matter how powerful." Their statement was echoed by the Democratic Alliance (DA), the main opposition party, who called Malema's behavior reckless and arrogant. In a sharp rebuke, DA parliamentarian Ian Cameron said, "By firing a weapon in public and then mocking the court, Julius Malema sends the message that he is above the law. Parliament cannot afford to let its members act like warlords. This is not revolution, it's chaos." But the EFF Malema's party fired back. They called the case a racially motivated attack orchestrated by the state and a white supremacist network. Spokesperson Thomas Mabus, flanked by loyalists, declared that Malema would continue to show respect for due process by appearing in every court session, even as the party's online supporters mocked the very same magistrate Twanit Olafir, calling her incompetent and racist. The tension thickened when the right-wing civil group AfriForum, who had long criticized Malema's Kill the Boer chants, released a celebratory statement. Their head of community safety, Jacques Broudrick, said, "This ruling restores public faith in justice. For too long, political elites acted with impunity. Today, South Africans saw that even powerful men can be held accountable." To Malema's base, that statement was proof of collusion. To his critics, it was vindication. Every side claimed victory. Every side felt wronged. Even religious leaders weighed in, some calling for repentance, others warning that South Africa was witnessing the rebirth of persecution politics. Television panels debated through the night while EFF supporters lit red flares outside the courthouse, chanting the old struggle songs of the 1980s. For many ordinary citizens, it was exhausting. "It feels like we're reliving the past again," one caller told a Johannesburg radio station. Different faces, same fire. And perhaps the most haunting question came from a retired lawyer watching the coverage at home. If every judgment becomes a battlefield of race and ideology, then where does justice go to find peace? By nightfall, the courthouse stood empty, but its echoes remained. In the eyes of the law, Julius Malema was now a convicted criminal. In the hearts of millions, he was still a revolutionary. And somewhere between those two truths, the nation trembled, unsure which one to believe. In the days following the verdict, South Africa entered a strange silence, the kind that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion. The shouting had stopped, the courtroom emptied, yet the arguments spilled into every living room, cafe, and township street corner. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had someone to blame. For the economic freedom fighters, this was not a defeat. It was a political weapon. Within hours, their media channels released statements portraying Malema as a victim of apartheid's lingering ghosts. The language was deliberate, almost poetic. A black man judged for daring to speak truth to power. Their rallies multiplied, their red banners rose higher, and for many of South Africa's young and unemployed, Malema's conviction became proof that the system feared the poor more than it feared corruption. Yet, on the other side, the ruling party and opposition alike saw a dangerous precedent not for democracy, but for defiance. To them, Malema's refusal to accept the court's ruling and his constant accusations of racism were eroding the very idea of accountability. One ANC veteran said on national television, "If every guilty man calls himself a martyr, then we will have no justice left to believe in." The civil impact was immediate. Churches, student unions, and civic groups began to debate what kind of nation South Africa had become, one where rule of law seemed negotiable depending on political color. In Parliament, whispers began circulating: could Julius Malema keep his seat if the sentencing exceeded 12 months? Under Section 47 of the Constitution, the answer was clear. No member sentenced to more than a year in prison without the option of a fine can serve in Parliament for 5 years after completing their sentence. That legal clause became the center of a constitutional storm. Lawyers on both sides speculated on its interpretation. If Malema's sentence were suspended pending appeal, would the rule still apply? Would the EFF lose its parliamentary voice, or would the courts fear igniting an even larger backlash by removing him? Meanwhile, ordinary citizens felt the consequences in subtler, deeper ways. Trust, already fragile, began to crack further. The justice system was now viewed through a racial lens. Judges became targets of online abuse. Every verdict, even in unrelated cases, was suddenly questioned. Who do they really work for became a common refrain in markets and taxis. Media analysts noticed another shift, a surge in online radicalization. EFF supporters framed Malema's trial as proof that the revolution had not ended, it had merely changed form. To them, the enemy was no longer the old apartheid state, but the new elite hiding behind robes and constitutions. And yet, amid the anger, some saw a warning sign, a reminder that the fragile democracy built after 1994 was now straining under the weight of its own contradictions. South Africa had promised equality before the law, but decades of poverty and inequality had left millions disillusioned. Malema's conviction for many symbolized not justice served, but justice selectively applied. As one journalist wrote in the Sunday Times, when people stop believing in the courts, they start believing in the streets. And that perhaps was the true danger, not the fate of one man, but the fate of a nation whose faith in its own democracy was quietly slipping away. To much of the world, the conviction of Julius Malema might seem like a local courtroom drama, another African politician facing justice for his excesses. But to those who have watched Africa's political story unfold for decades, it represents something far deeper, a test of how democracy itself survives under pressure and how the world chooses to see it. Western media headlines were swift, simple, and predictable: populist leader convicted in South Africa. Yet behind those headlines lay an uncomfortable truth. The same nations that preach the rule of law have often tolerated or even supported far worse in leaders they found useful. Across Africa, many asked quietly, would Washington have applauded the verdict if Malema had been a loyal Western ally? The mention of the Oval Office in Malema's fiery speech was not random. To his supporters, it symbolized a global hierarchy of power, one where Western approval still matters more than African self-determination. Whether true or not, that perception fuels resentment. It reminds millions that post-colonial politics are never fully free from external influence. The court may have been local, but the judgment was received as global. In Washington and Brussels, analysts framed the case as a sign that South African institutions remain strong. In Beijing and Moscow, state media took the opposite angle, suggesting that Western influence still manipulates African justice systems to silence anti-imperial voices. In Nairobi, Dakar, and Ouagadougou, opinion writers debated whether Malema's trial marked a warning for the new generation of leaders, especially those like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, who speak boldly against Western systems while promising national sovereignty. American commentators, particularly among the older generation, recognized echoes of something familiar: the tension between protest and order, between justice and rebellion. Some compared Malema to radical figures of the 1960s civil rights era, fiery, divisive, idealistic, and dangerous in equal measure. Others saw him as a cautionary tale, a man whose thirst for revolution blinded him to responsibility. But for Africans across the diaspora in Chicago, Atlanta, Kingston, and Port-au-Prince, the story struck a different chord. It wasn't about legality, it was about legacy. They saw in Malema's conviction a reminder of how easily defiance becomes criminalized when it threatens power. They recalled how many liberation leaders had been jailed first and celebrated later. And yet, even among those sympathetic to him, an unease lingered. There is a fine line between revolution and recklessness, between freedom and chaos. When leaders who call for justice begin to act above the law, the cause itself begins to fracture. In the end, the Malema verdict became more than a South African story. It became a mirror for every nation struggling to balance dissent and discipline. For the United States still wrestling with its own divisions, it was a quiet warning that democracy doesn't die when people protest. It dies when no one trusts justice anymore. As the dust settles over Pretoria's courthouse, the verdict against Julius Malema remains more than a legal sentence. It is a mirror of a nation's soul. The law has spoken, yes, but the echoes of that judgment will travel far beyond the walls of any courtroom. They will seep into classrooms, homes, and parliaments, into the fragile conscience of a country still learning what justice really means. Because in the end, this is not just about one man and one rifle. It is about what happens when a nation loses faith in its own laws. When every verdict is seen as political, and every protest becomes a trial of loyalty, democracy itself begins to suffocate. South Africa's greatest danger is not rebellion, it is mistrust. And mistrust, once rooted in the hearts of a people, can bring down more than governments. It can bring down hope. Yet there is still a way forward. It lies not in defending men, but in defending principles. It lies in recognizing that true justice is not black or white, left or right. It is the light that guides both rich and poor toward accountability. It is the same light that nations across Africa, from Ghana to Mali, from Niger to Burkina Faso, are now struggling to reclaim on their own terms. In that struggle, one name keeps returning: Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, whose push for African sovereignty has inspired millions. His rise and the movements it has sparked remind us that leadership rooted in integrity can heal what politics divides. But it also raises a haunting question. Can the next generation of African leaders resist the same temptations that now haunt Julius Malema? To my American audience, those who remember the civil rights marches, who have seen history's cycles of hope and betrayal, this story may feel painfully familiar. The fight for justice is never clean. It is human. It is flawed. But it demands courage and clarity. So tonight, as we close this chapter, ask yourself, do you believe Africa is ready to choose justice over personality? Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's path of reform can truly hold where others have fallen to ego and corruption? Please share this video if you believe that leadership built on truth can still change history. Subscribe if you believe that justice, not noise, not power, but justice must remain the heartbeat of every nation.